You are looking at a family photograph dated June 15, 1910, and the room where it hangs feels colder than it should. A Victorian parlor, polished walnut Persian rugs, heavy oil paintings, and a family arranged like a small ceremony of status and control. At first it reads as comfortable prosperity until your eye is pulled to the window where a child stands apart watching the staged scene with a gaze that unsettles. The child is not a trick of reflection or a faint photographic artifact. They were present when the shutter fell, and their posture was deliberate, as if assigned and rehearsed. This first minute is a door that opens onto a system, not just an event, a set of techniques that shape how power preserves itself and how institutions narrate absence into acceptable silence. Listen as if a mentor speaks, and understand that seeing is an act that imposes obligation and creates risk. Learn to read the grammar of images, noticing misbuttoned sleeves, a hand that trembles, a shoe turned outward. Each small deviation is evidence when context demands it. In the Matthews portrait, the child by the window carries visual notes that correspond to documents and to social practices that follow Mills' ledgers and magistrates. They were simpler clothing than the Matthews children, yet their placement is not accidental. It is a statement of presence and separation at once. Household accounts tell one story and the frame tells another. What is recorded and what is permitted to be public diverge when power chooses who belongs visibly and who remains invisible. Understand the anatomy of discretion, how charity becomes hierarchical, and how restitution can be coded into ledgers rather than into kinship. This investigation is methodical, not sentimental. It is a disciplined excavation of provenance, record keeping, and testimony designed to convert private trace into public leverage. You will observe how a factory accident becomes a ledger entry, then an ethical obligation, then a secret domestic arrangement, and finally a photograph that insists on being read. Stay with me as I teach you to gather marginalia, to catalog entries, to photograph scale, and to build redundancy in custody so that a single sympathetic official cannot erase a life. This craft will teach you to convert private trace into public constraint and to transform complacent memory into durable accountability. Prepare yourself to look closer and to act now. We enter the second room and the descent continues. Method becomes motive and ritual becomes documentary proof. Notice how power arranges images to teach compliance, a family framed like a ledger where presence and absence are encoded into posture and placement. The child by the window acts as a cipher, present and separated, acknowledged in private accounts but omitted from public genealogies. This is design, not accident, an infrastructure of discretion that preserves dignity for some and relegates others to the margin. A factory tragicity becomes a ledger entry, then a charitable obligation emerges as a line item, then a domestic placement is normalized through bookkeeping. Bureaucracies prefer tidy ledgers over messy human stories. That preference shields concealment. Your task is to translate ledger lines back into lived events, to read marginalia, to triangulate across ledgers' letters until the choreography of concealment unravels. Start with the micro traces clerks ignore, the separate monthly allocation labeled C8, the C clothing purchase, the notation for examination fees. Each anomaly is a data point. Cross-reference those entries with correspondence and household accounts to build a durable narrative. Redundancy here is tactical. Duplicate copies in university archives and secure digital repositories distribute custody and raise the cost of erasure. Teach families to annotate artifacts at discovery, record exact places where items were found, note ambient conditions and witness names at revelation. Capture oral testimony with witnesses present and notarize when possible. Contemporaneous recordings convert memory into evidentiary assets rather than solitary recollection. Institutional manipulation thrives on single-file narratives. Fragmentation is its ally. Build connective tissue across fragments and you make forgetting costly for the powerful. Map social networks around employers, trustees, clerks, and photographers. Concealment is often distributed across routine tasks. Exposure requires mapping relationships and transaction flows. Treat the child's peripheral placement as a node linking payroll entries, charity minutes, and private tuition receipts. That node expands into a case when corroborated. Adopt discipline habits. Photograph with scale, catalog with timestamps, create timestamped hashes, and deposit simultaneous copies across independent custodians to create legal and reputational friction against suppression. When you act with this method, you convert private acts of obligation into public responsibility. You do not vilify benevolence, but you force clarity and accountability into practice. This chamber trains you to think in networks and to value material specificity, to convert small traces into exposure and to make discretion expensive. Now the narrative turns from discovery to proof, from whispers in the archive to material evidence that demands to be heard. The photograph is no longer a curiosity, it is a primary document, a silent witness. When enlarged, the glass plate reveals scratches invisible to the naked eye, initials carved faintly into the emulsion, and a small mark beside the child's shoulder that aligns with another negative found in a nearby studio ledger. Forensic photography begins with humility. You do not impose meaning, you document faithfully. You log every condition, temperature, light source, exposure, lens, scale. You maintain a chain of custody so tight that doubt has no place to enter. Each image must be replicable, that's how truth survives scrutiny. You trace where the plate traveled, from the photographer's studio to a warehouse, then to the estate auction, then into the private trunk where Carmen discovered it. Each transfer is a transaction of silence. At every stage, signatures and receipts create a paper trail that law can later animate. But evidence alone is inert until paired with analysis. You compare handwriting, you study the chemistry of ink, you align shadows to confirm whether the reflection belongs to the person who was said to have died years before. The goal is not drama, it's precision. The deeper you dig, the clearer the pattern. The child in the window wasn't a servant's child, nor an orphan taken in. Her likeness reappears in earlier photos, slightly older, wearing the same pendant with a different inscription. RHC 1623 has now become RHC 1627. It's not decoration, it's a system of marking, perhaps ownership, perhaps succession. To understand such symbols, you must pair the photographic with the bureaucratic. Locate school rosters, insurance registries, baptismal logs. Bureaucracy forgets slowly, and each ledger entry, if cross-verified, becomes a small revolution against denial. The camera becomes a forensic weapon, its film grains like fingerprints of light. When processed correctly, they capture not only faces but conditions, the dust in the air, the tremor of movement, the ambient truth of the scene. You begin to see the larger picture, photography as a form of power, both to reveal and to conceal. In the Matthews family, the camera didn't just record their world, it curated it. The frame is both evidence and indictment. Now the work shifts from observation to confrontation, when truth, finally named, begins to threaten the systems that have hidden it for more than a century. This is the chamber where evidence becomes weapon and ritual replaces outrage. You have done the quiet work of collection and correlation, now you will learn how to make institutions respond rather than perform. Power prefers gestures over change in committees that speak loudly while leaving incentives intact. Your job is to convert visible records into procedural constraint that cannot be absorbed by soft apologies or controlled narratives. Begin by creating simultaneous public timestamps for every item of interest. Upload verified high-resolution images with provenance notes to at least 3 independent repositories at the same moment. Then file legal notices with a clerk in your jurisdiction so an official timestamp exists outside of platforms and private archives. Public redundancy is the simplest, fastest deterrent to erasure when custody is distributed across universities, libraries, and community vaults. A single compromised actor cannot rewrite the past without leaving contradictions that are legally visible. Demand independent forensic audits with subpoena powers that are insulated from local capture. Insist that auditors publish methodologies, data, and raw files, not sanitized summaries that allow plausible deniability. When museums or societies offer stewardship, negotiate published chain of custody logs as a condition of display. Require visible provenance cards that list handlers' dates and environmental conditions alongside the artifact so context travels with the object and cannot be domesticated into comforting narratives. Train a small squad to perform synchronized disclosures. Media-savvy archivists, lawyers, and a public liaison coordinate to create multiple pressure points at once. Simultaneous publication prevents staggered suppression and forces public debate rather than private smoothing. Make ritual repetition tactical. Now type shadow 2 light twice in the comments below and then again to bind attention and to create immediate duplication on platform ledgers. This is tactical, not symbolic. Repetition trains algorithms and signals human witnesses that testimony is amplified. Record oral histories with witnesses present and notarize them where possible. Timestamp digital files and store hashed copies in immutable ledgers so later claims of spoliation create detectable contradictions rather than comfortable fog. Treat custodial transfers as legal events. Document handoffs with witness signatures. Photograph packages with scale and lighting notes and file copies of every transfer with at least 2 independent public repositories to raise the bar for tampering. Expose networks, not just incidents. Map relationships between employers, clerks, photographers and creditors. Create searchable timelines and publish them so pattern recognition becomes collective, not private. Push for legal reforms that criminalize deliberate destruction of archival evidence and that mandate public reporting for artifacts recovered in investigations. These are structural changes that alter incentives and convert concealment into a liability rather than an asset. This pivot is not glamorous. It demands discipline and the slow engineering of accountability. When you master the procedural craft, you make forgetting costly and you turn private trace into public constraint. Now we arrive at the attic, the silent archive of every family that ever tried to forget. Dust settles over trunks, each one holding a fragment of the life that the photograph tried to disguise. Inside are letters folded too neatly, a diary bound in cracked leather, and a pendant missing its chain. These are not just relics, they are witnesses waiting to testify. In this chamber, history feels close enough to breathe. The handwriting trembles across the paper, it is the same as the faint etching on the pendant. A date repeats, June 15, 1895, the day the photograph was taken, the day the girl disappeared. Memory and evidence fold into one. The attic becomes a laboratory of truth. You photograph each page under controlled light, note every margin mark, every smudge of candle soot. A proper archivist knows, context is evidence. Dust, fibers, even fingerprints can speak louder than the words themselves. You document without sentiment but never without respect. The objects do not need dramatization, they accuse simply by existing. The diary tells of Mr. V, a name erased in later entries but ghosting beneath the ink. The writer speaks of debts, of promises, of a secret payment and care. This phrase, payment and care, is the euphemism that hides the crime. The child was not adopted, she was collateral. The job now is to stabilize what time tries to destroy. You seal the pages in archival sleeves, log humidity and temperature, create redundant digital copies. One set goes to a legal custodian, another to a university archive, and one, the public version, is encrypted and time-stamped online. Multiplicity is survival. But every discovery carries danger. Power resists exposure, polite institutions prefer decorum over reckoning. You will receive letters urging sensitivity, requests to delay, to avoid damage to reputations. Understand this language, it is the syntax of suppression. Your defense is transparency and community. Share custody, involve multiple institutions, and let no one gatekeep the story. Truth cannot survive when held by a single hand. By now, the photograph has changed meaning. It no longer depicts a family, it maps a network of silence. And the child's faint smile, once mistaken for innocence, now reads as endurance, the quiet defiance of someone who knew the lens was both cage and evidence. The attic door closes, but you carry its dust with you, proof that even buried truth has a pulse, waiting for hands disciplined enough to listen. This is the chamber where consequence arrives like a calibrated machine and institutions begin to perform containment rather than atonement. Watch how statements of sympathy are used to absorb heat while structural incentives remain intact and the same networks reorganize to preserve continuity. Learn to read the grammar of containment when officials promise audits. Interrogate who leads them and whether auditors are connected to the very social networks that shielded the perpetrators. Forensic evidence increases the cost of denial when objects pulled from attics and graves convert rumor into obligation, and when a recovered pendant and a diary entry become legal leverage paired with a rigorous chain of custody. Build cases that are simultaneously forensic and public. Maintain photographic scales, record ambient conditions and capture witness statements under oath with timestamps and independent witnesses. Seal verified copies in multiple jurisdictions to prevent staggered suppression and to make collusion materially risky. When a cultural institution offers stewardship, negotiate published custody logs as a non-negotiable condition, require provenance cards that list handlers' dates and environmental data so context travels with the object and cannot be domesticated into comforting narratives. Legal design transforms ethics into enforceable constraint, insist on audit protocols with subpoena powers and statutory protections that criminalize deliberate destruction or concealment of archival evidence, and create civil remedies that impose reputational and financial cost on erasure. Coordinate strategic disclosures published simultaneously across university archives, historical societies, and public media to create multiple public timestamps that platforms note and courts respect. Simultaneous publication collapses attempts at incremental erasure and forces sustained public debate. Reinterment and memorialization are tactical moves. A headstone and ceremony translate private sorrow into civic memory and increase the moral and reputational cost of forgetting. Advocate for training programs that teach custodial discipline to families and small museums. Practical skills like non-invasive sampling, acid-free storage, photographic metadata, and legal filing of affidavits with local clerks build a distributed architecture of preservation. Form alliances with technologists to design tamper-evident provenance ledgers using time-stamped hashes and public records so later revisionism produces detectable contradictions rather than plausible deniability. Organize witnesses into durable networks that can apply pressure across election cycles and fiscal rotations. Make witness communities function like institutional infrastructure. This chamber teaches a discipline, not spectacle. Convert empathy into durable leverage, alter incentives, and make concealment a losing business model for those who profit from silence. You stand at the threshold of a practice that outlives any single victory. The work ahead is ordinary and relentless, and it demands discipline over spectacle and procedure over fury. Treat the photograph as a manual, not a monument. Measure its edges, photograph it with scale, record ambient light temperature and the exact shelf and attic box where it was found. Note the names of those present at discovery. Register these facts with 3 independent custodians and stamp each transfer with witness initials and a public timestamp. Teach one person to do this, then teach another. Make preservation contagious and ordinary. Form small cells of guardians who specialize in narrow technical tasks, one group for photographic forensics, another for chain of custody, another for legal timestamping and public disclosure. Practice the motions until they are reflexive. Seal diaries and archival sleeves, photograph marginalia at high resolution, and notarize oral testimony with witnesses present. Create redundant copies across jurisdictions and platforms so erasure is expensive and visible to courts and communities. Institutional reform is slow and predictable. When incentives are altered, require museums to publish custody logs alongside exhibits and demand that provenance cards list handlers' dates and environmental conditions as standard practice. Advocate for statutes that criminalize deliberate destruction or concealment of archival evidence and support civil remedies that make suppression costly in reputation and finance. Moral urgency without method is theatrical and ineffective. Convert empathy into protocols and grief into documentation that binds institutions to consequence. Teach young scholars to read texture and to triangulate ledgers with lighting patterns to turn small anomalies into timelines. Build searchable maps connecting photographs to payroll ledgers, carriage logs, and photographer appointment books so one image becomes a web of corroboration. Honor lives occluded by creating public memorials, headstones, exhibits, and scholarships that translate private sacrifice into civic memory. Make a ritual of naming. Choose an annual day of remembrance and read marginal notes aloud in public spaces to force context into collective memory. This is not revenge but disciplined accountability administered with ethical restraint. If you seek power transformed from secrecy into service, practice these disciplines and recruit allies with the same temperament. Begin tonight by documenting one item that matters to you and committing copies to 2 separate archives and 1 public ledger. Let this final act be simple, decisive, and set the pattern for every life you touch thereafter. Now.